Hello, everyone, and welcome to Lunch Break Science. I'm Ariel Johnson from the Leakey Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting human evolution research and sharing discoveries in programs like this. We'd like to thank the Anne and Gordon Getty Foundation and Camilla and George Smith, whose generous support made this episode of Lunch Break Science possible. Here with us today is paleoanthropologist Dr. Jeremy DeSilva, and he's also a Leakey Foundation grant recipient. Jerry, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks, Ariel. I really appreciate the opportunity and the invitation. It's great to chat with you.
Yeah. So, Jerry, you are joining us from Vermont, correct? Is that
correct? Yep.
Correct. Okay.
Norwich, Vermont. Yep.
Yeah. Where and you are associate professor of anthropology at Dartmouth College, where you study the origins and evolution of bipedal walking. This research has taken you all over the world to excavations and collections, including Leitoli in Tanzania, where some amazing footprints of our early ancestors have been discovered, as well as the cradle of humankind in South Africa, just to name a few. Today, we're going to be celebrating quite a few things, in fact. So tomorrow is Charles Darwin's 212th birthday, so happy birthday, Charles. Happy early birthday, I guess. We're also celebrating the 150th anniversary of the publication of Darwin's Descent of Man this year, and the celebration of a publication of another visionary book, which our guest, Jerry, spearheaded, A Most Interesting Problem, What Darwin's Descent of Man Got Right and Wrong About Human Evolution. We'll be continuing to celebrate this Saturday, February 13th, with a free virtual event featuring Jerry, along with Darwin historian Janet Brown, anthropologist Brian Hare, Johannes Haile Selassie, Holly Dunsworth, Augustine Fuentes, and award-winning science journalist Ann Gibbons. We've shared a link for this event in the chat and the video description. It's an event you cannot miss, so we hope we'll see you all there. And to boot, today is Lunch Break Science's 20th episode, so it's a lot to celebrate. So yay! Jerry, again, I'm just so excited to have you here. And before we get started into the main program, if you're watching us live on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, or Leakey Foundation Live, you can submit questions at any time in the chat, and Jerry will be answering them at the end of the episode. The earlier you get those questions in, the more likely he'll be able to answer them. Jerry, I have to hand it to you because I think you are the reason we're having this celebration of Darwin. Actually, you are absolutely. It was back in 2019. We were having a lecture at the Houston Museum of Natural Science. I have actually a little clip from it here. We will actually share the link in the video description and the chat as well, because it was an amazing talk. But while you were giving that lecture, you had mentioned to the Leakey Foundation staff that you had this really amazing project where you were editing a volume looking at what Darwin wrote in Descent of Man and updating it. So as I said, it's been a pleasure to work with you on all of these programs. And as I said, I'm just so excited to have you on the program.
Yeah, it's really great to be here. And this project of reflecting on Darwin 150 years after he wrote Descent of Man, it has been so wonderful for me to work with a dozen or so colleagues and to see how they think about Darwin, how they read Darwin's chapters, and then reflect on it 150 years later. Because you read Darwin now, and sometimes you read a passage and you say, wow, that's an amazing insight. And he had this extraordinary ability to not only describe the intricate details of life on our planet, but to take a big step back and to see the bigger picture. And I think as scientists, we all strive to be able to do that, to describe our little pieces of the puzzle we're trying to figure out, but also see the bigger picture of why we do what we do. And then at the same time, you'll flip a page to a different part of Descent of Man and cringe at some of the wording he uses. And so, the opportunity I saw here, I love anniversaries. I love, for instance, in 2024, it'll be the 100th anniversary of the discovery of the Talon child.
Yes.
That's going to be so much fun to think about 100 years of Australopithecus, right? Um, and this I saw as an opportunity of 150 years later, where is our science?
Yeah.
What do we know? What don't we know? And using Darwin, and what a great place to start, right? In terms of what did he get right? What do we still think is the case? For instance, the earliest human fossils being found primarily on the African continent, which he predicted, and then what did he get wrong? And mostly what he got wrong had to do with our understanding currently of human biological diversity and sex differences. So I was so grateful for the authors that saw this vision that I kind of imagined, and they saw it through in this really, I'm holding the book now, this really wonderful book. And then Princeton University Press, and Allison Collette was our editor, and she was just wonderful to work with.
Well, we're really excited for the event on Saturday and, to hear more about your research now. So, I'll start off with asking you, you know, why is the fact that we became bipedal so important?
So it's weird. Moving on two legs is just strange. There's no other mammal on Earth that habitually walks around on its extended hind limbs the way we do. So you look around the natural world and you see mammals that fly and swim and leap and swing, and most mammals are just your plain old quadruped, right? Like a dog or a squirrel or a cow or a goat. Moving on two legs is just really odd. And not only that, but it makes us incredibly slow, and it makes us vulnerable to predation, vulnerable to injury. And so it really raises this fascinating evolutionary question of how in the world did such a locomotion that seemingly is disadvantageous in terms of speed and vulnerability to predation and injury. How did it evolve? And so I'm fascinated by how this happened, when this happened, where it happened, why it happened, and mostly what I've sort of come to discover as I've been doing this work is that bipedalism happened early in the lineage, and it set the stage for all of the changes, or many of the changes that we see subsequent. Whether it's increase in brain size, changes in how we use our landscape, technological advances, even the mechanics of birth and how we raise and parent our children, all these things in some way, shape, or form are connected to this unusual form of locomotion that we engage in. So to me, it all starts with bipedalism, and understanding bipedalism helps us understand the human condition and the evolution of humans.
When we're looking back at the fossil record, what exactly does the evidence for bipedalism consist of?
So bones and fossils, for the most part. I mean, we study other animals too, to try to see the circumstances and the frequency of bipedal locomotion in, say, chimpanzees or bonobos and gorillas and orangutans and gibbons. But what I work mostly with are the physical remains that our ancestors have fortunately left us, in the form of fossils, and so we have a rich fossil record that documents the evolution of bipedalism, going back at least 4 million years, and then we start to lose the trail a little bit, and the fossils in the 5 million, 6 million, 7 million year range are much more fragmentary and much more controversial, which frankly is exactly what you might expect for an evolving lineage, right? That as you get closer to the common ancestor, it's going to be more and more difficult to identify those features that are unique to our lineage versus another. So the fossil record is particularly important, and then also fossil footprints. Fossil footprints are these extraordinary moments in time in the life of an individual. And so I had the real fortune, I'll talk about this in a moment, I had the great fortune to go to the site of Laetoli in 2019 with Charles Masiba and our students, and oh, what a special place. And so the fossilized footprints, to me, they they're a little different from the bones. The bones, are recording sort of the evolutionary history that led up to the anatomy you're looking at. Bones are like these little time capsules that are recording also the life of the individual, whereas footprints are just a window into that moment in time in that individual's life. And so they give us a different kind of piece of information about our ancestors. And I think they complement each other really, really well.
So what was it like being at Laetolium? It's such a famous location.
Oh God, I loved it. It was just where we camped was magnificent and beautiful. There were zebras and giraffe that came through camp in the morning. Working with local Tanzanians and Tanzanian scientists at the site was just such a thrill. I learned so much from my colleagues on how to read the footprint ash, both geologically, but also ecologically, of the footprints that we're seeing. What made those, and for some of the individuals to be able to point out, oh, that's zebra, that's antelope, that's clearly from a like a lagomorph, like a rabbit of sorts. And then of course the hominin prints. So I think both the historical element of it was pretty special, to know that Mary Leakey had done some of her foundational work there.
Yeah.
And she's such an idol of mine, to know that she made those great discoveries there, and also to look over this landscape and to see how big it is. Light's huge,
Yeah.
and to think about how much is yet to be discovered. There was so much still to be discovered at that site. So it was pretty special to be there and to have that realization that, wow, there's decades of work still to be done at this locality.
Now, one of the things that I found most fascinating that I learned from you is that once you uncover footprints, that they've got a very, very short shelf life.
Yeah, it depends on the sediment in which they were made and sort of the integrity of that long term. But yeah, erosion sort of uncovers them and exposes them and gives them to us and allows us to discover them. But then those erosive processes continue on, and they end up causing these prints, whether they're in volcanic ash in Eastern Africa or along the shores in the UK. There are footprints there that are close to 1 million years old, and they end up sort of returning to the earth and being broken down. And so it's really important to document them before they are destroyed. So taking multiple photographs and making sure that you can do photogrammetry, reconstructions of the sites. And then we also, I'll talk about this in a little bit, we also brought a 3D laser scanner out with us, and we're able to digitally document the footprints as well, so that even if those erode away, we have a digital copy of them long term for future scientists to re-examine.
So, kind of taking a step back, you've been interested, or you've been curious about science for a very long time, but weren't always on the track to becoming a paleoanthropologist. Where did your start on the path to studying bipedal walking start?
Yeah, I was a latecomer to this. So when I was a little kid, I loved puzzles and mysteries, and I loved the natural world, and I loved lifting up rocks and looking for bugs and critters, and I loved looking up into the sky. And so I was always into science, and if my dream of becoming the point guard for the Boston Celtics didn't turn out, then I was going to become a scientist, and sure enough, that didn't turn out for me. So I went to college with the intention of studying astronomy. And I was, I was pretty obsessed with all things Carl Sagan at
Oh
the
yeah.
time. I went to Cornell, and actually met him a couple times. He sat in on a class that I was taking on the search for life elsewhere in the universe, and it was just amazing to see him sort of model scientific discourse and questioning, and to be that sort of that informed skeptic that I think we all strive to be as good scientists. But I ended up switching to physiology and biology, and honestly, I graduated college without really knowing what I wanted to do. I never took a biological anthropology course in college, um, and after college, I ended up working at the Boston Museum of Science, and it was there that I rediscovered my love for science, rediscovered my love for teaching, um, and thinking about scientific questions. And my boss, who is the amazing science educator, Lucy Kirshner, she and I talked about a cast that we had of the Bertelli footprints and what we could do with visitors to really have these come to life. And in doing that, I went up to the museum library and read Ian Tattersall books. Read as much as I could on the topic. Read, of course, Lucy, Don Johansson's books, and I got hooked.
Yeah.
I was bitten by the hominid bug, right? And I was obsessed with the stories that we can tell from these fossils about our ancestors, and the information that you can squeeze out of these fragmentary remains. To me, it was magic, and I wanted to learn how to do it. So I reached out to professors in the Boston area, and Laura McClatchy, who was at Boston University, came to the museum, and we gave a presentation on Sahelanthropus, which had just been announced to the world. This was back in 2001 or two, 2002, I think. And then she accepted me as a graduate student. And so we ended up at the University of Michigan, where I had just an amazing cohort of fellow grad students, and then met John Mitani, and was given the opportunity to go to the Ngogo chimpanzee site in Western Uganda, the Kabale National Park, and started my dissertation research on climbing adaptations in the ankle and the feet in living apes, and then of course how we can find skeletal correlates of that, and then ask the question of the fossils that we have, whether the fossils indicate these same kind of climbing abilities. And so that's how I got specifically into the foot and the ankle, was in part because of observations that I was able to make on those chimpanzees in Western Uganda. So going out and seeing apes in the wild really influenced how I think about these bones, that are not moving, lying on a table as you're
Yeah.
studying them and measuring them. It's really good to know how the fleshed out creatures that those bones were once in, how they actually move around their world.
Could you, when you were looking at the chimpanzees, were you like picturing in your head what their bones look like?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, I do that with people too. Like, and so yeah, with the chimps, one of the things that they would do, which just blew my mind, is when a chimp climbs a tree, it can essentially press the top of its foot against its shin. So it has so much flexibility in its ankle that it would pull that foot way close to the shin. And I started, playing with my own foot and seeing if I could do that. And of course I couldn't, and thought, well, geez, A, the Achilles tendon would rupture if I did that, or B, one of my ligaments, anterior talofibular ligament would rupture. This seems like how are they able to pull this off? And that led to all sorts of really fun investigations of the ankle in chimpanzees, and then of course got me into hominid vaults to study Lucy's ankle, and the ankles of all sorts of other hominids that have been discovered all throughout the Rift Valley and in the cradle of humankind, South Africa.
And you've seen, so many different fossils and collections. Has there ever been a piece that you found particularly puzzling?
Pretty much everything that Lee Berger finds has been incredibly puzzling to me. Right when I finished my PhD was when Australopithecus Sediba was discovered, and I was invited to work on that material by Lee and along with Bernard Zipfel, who is the curator of the fossils in South Africa at the University of Witwatersrand, and he he used to be a podiatrist, and so he really understands feet. And he and I teamed up to try to figure this creature out, and it was hard. It was really hard. In part, it was so I've got one of my favorite fossils here. This is the heel of Australopithecus Sediba, and a replica. It's a 3D printout of the heel, and it's shockingly ape-like. It doesn't have the big puffiness underneath it that heel striking bipeds have, like us. But even like Lucy species has a big chunky heel to dissipate those high forces of impact when you're walking on two legs. And here we have a biped without it, which I wouldn't have thought was possible. So it was so much fun to try to work on the gait kinematics. How was this thing moving around its world? And then, of course, the follow-up to that, the sequel, was the discovery of Homo Noletti. And in January 2016, I looked at all that material for the first time, and I remember, hours and hours and hours and hours with it. And I remember emerging from there and telling Lee that, this to me looked like a better Homo habilis than Homo habilis. That it looked like a potential, that it looked more derived than Australopithecus, but potentially more primitive than Homo erectus. And then, of course, comes the shock of the date, that it was much more recent than I would have expected. And it was because no matter how much we all say it, we still think linearly.
Yeah.
It's hard not to. And so when you find something that sort of fills in a gap in anatomical gap, say, you want to then place it chronologically in that spot. And it wasn't. It lived much more recently than I think many of us would have expected, which was so much fun, right? As a scientist, when you get surprised by something, it's wonderful. It's really fun. It means that there are all these new questions that you get to ask that you never thought about or you never considered asking prior to a new discovery like Homo Noletti. So, Australopithecus Sediba and Homo Noletti were wonderfully puzzling for me, and in many ways, we're still trying to figure them out.
Well, I really am excited to hear your talk. So let's turn the virtual floor over to you and hear more about the origins and evolution of bipedal walking.
Okay, sounds good. So I will share my screen. Does that work?
Yes, you are all set.
Okay.
I'll see you on the other end.
Wonderful. So as we've been discussing, Ariel, I'm really interested in bipedalism and the origins and evolution of upright walking. And as we've discussed, this has deep roots in the past. That bipedalism goes back to the very beginnings of our lineage, and it is a hallmark of being human. And this is something that I expand on, talk a lot more about in a book. So shameless self-promotion here. I have a book that's being published on April 6th. It's available for pre-order right now, published through HarperCollins, called First Steps: How Upright Walking Made Us Human. And in it, I lay out what we understand currently about the when and where and how and why about the origins of bipedalism, but also dive into the consequences that it had for our biology, and that continues even today. So as we've discussed, I work mostly on feet and ankles, although I've also, it's hard to do that in isolation. So legs and hips are also quite interesting to me as well. Anything give us evidence for this form of locomotion we've been talking about, this upright walking. But I've been super lucky. that in the last 20 years, last 15 to 20 years, there have been so many new foot fossils that have been discovered. Prior to that, there were isolated bones, but there weren't many feet. And feet are fascinating. They're made of 26 individual bones, and you've got 2 feet, right? So 52 bones. A quarter of your skeleton is made of foot bones. And they fit together in this really amazing geometric pattern that allows us to figure out how the foot was being used in these past ancestors of ours. And so with all these new foot fossils, Bernard Zipfel, who I mentioned, my friend and colleague in South Africa, and my former graduate student, Ellie McNutt, who's just been hired for a new position at Ohio University. We traveled all over Eastern and Southern Africa studying these foot bones. And then we met at Dartmouth, and we had a 2-week workshop where we tried to arrange all of the fossil foot bones that we could get our hands on chronologically. That's what you sort of see along the x-axis on this table, and then by element along the y-axis. And we tried to make sense of the evolutionary trajectory, the variation of foot anatomy over time, and what that tells us about the evolution of bipedal walking in our ancestors. And this is work that we've published now in Evolutionary Anthropology, and then in 2019, I published a review in the Yearbook of Physical Anthropology. And there were lots of things that we think we figured out, all subject to change as new fossils are discovered. But one of the things that really stuck out was that there were all sorts of different experiments going on, especially early on in the evolution of the hominin foot and in the Australopithecus foot. So when you when you say an Australopithecus foot, really it's which one? Which one are you talking about? There's so much variation in these different foot fossils. Whereas in genus Homo, there seems to be less. Paranthropus, there seems to be less. And so all this really extraordinary anatomical, and I think therefore functional variation in how the foot is being used. So one example would be the foot of Australopithecus Sediba, which I just mentioned, which has that really unusual ape-like heel to it. And it is in many ways more primitive than the foot of Lucy and her kind, Australopithecus afarensis, even though it lived 1 million years later in time. So the chronology doesn't quite work out. And what that tells you again about is evolutionary experimentation, I think, happening in Australopithecus. Perhaps a little more, well, another example of this would be the really awesome discovery made by your Lunch Break Science guest from last week, Johannes Haile Selassie, who found and published in 2012 what is known as the Bertelli Foot at the Woronzo Mille study area in Ethiopia. And this is a foot that is anatomically quite different from the foot of Lucy's kind, Australopithecus afarensis, even though they lived at the same time. So these two hominins would have shared a very similar landscape, the same area of Ethiopia at the same time, 3 to 3.5 million years ago. So different forms of walking in hominins that were contemporaries, that were coexisting. So most of what we know about foot evolution and locomotor evolution in Australopithecus, of course, does come from Lucy's species. And in part, it's because we have just a really wonderful wealth of evidence. Yes, we have adult foot bones like what you see in the middle there, but there's also the remarkable foot of a child, the Dikika child, shown on the left, discovered by Zerai Alemzigid, and he and I published our anatomical description and functional interpretation of this foot a couple of years ago. And then, of course, on the far right, there are the Laetoli footprints. And so what a wonderful opportunity, right, to look at the ontogeny and development of the foot from a juvenile to an adult, and then to get some insight into the function of the foot by trying to match up or compare the anatomy to the footprints that are left in the volcanic ash. Of course, that volcanic ash and the footprints in that ash was discovered in 1976 by Mary Leakey and her team at the site of Laetoli in Tanzania, something we've talked about. But one of the things that is lesser known is that prior to the discovery of the very famous G prints at Laetoli, those are the ones that most people think of when they think of the Laetoli footprints. Prior to that was the discovery of a bipedal trail at a site known as the A site. And so these were made by something moving on two legs. And they were initially interpreted by Mary Leakey as coming from a hominid, but then they discovered the G prints. And in comparison to these, the G prints were so much more human-like that these became sort of mysterious. And what in the world are these when we have these G prints that are so clearly hominid? Well, one of the interpretations was that they might have been made by a bipedal bear. By an upright walking ursid, and bears will occasionally get up on two legs and walk bipedally. And so maybe that's what happened here. And in fact, Russ Tuttle at the University of Chicago published a few papers on this. But one of the things he mentioned was that until there were naturalistic studies done on bipedal bears, then the alternative hypotheses of this being hominid or ursid would just have to wait. Okay, well, one of the things we have up here at Dartmouth in New Hampshire and Vermont are bears, and we got lots of bears. And this is Ellie McNutt again collecting footprint data on bears. These are semi-wild bears who are being rehabilitated for re-release into the woods up here. And they can walk bipedally if you tempt them with maple syrup or milk or apples. And we have a lot of footprints. Now, in addition to that, Tim White and Gensua wrote that same year in 1987 that the A prints were quite enigmatic, and in order to really figure out what made them, they need to be more fully cleaned and followed laterally. And so in 2019, Charles Masiba and I brought our students out to Laetoli, as we've already discussed. And again, this was such it was a dream of mine to be at this site. We used Mary Leakey's maps to relocate at the A site where the prints should be, those original A prints. We expected that they were washed away. We expected that they had been eroded and we wouldn't recover them. When we measured out and got to where they should be, there was a patch of dirt and grass there. We started to excavate that area. And sure enough, on roughly day 3, I think, our Tanzanian colleague, Callisti Fabian, relocated them and found them in the volcanic ash layer. And so on the right image here, I got a cursor, you got a print here, 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 and here. There are 5 prints. We continued the excavation and couldn't find any more, unfortunately. But what we could do is do photogrammetry. And so we took a ton of pictures and were able to do photogrammetry of the site. And we also brought a 3D laser scanner. And with the 3D laser scanner, we were able to collect high resolution scans of the print so we can get depth of certain areas of the prints. And this was really fun work to be doing 3D laser scans of these prints out in the middle of nowhere. And so this is ongoing work. And it's being led by Ellie McNutt, and there's we're trying to figure out a little bit more about the nature of these prints, and hopefully you'll hear more by the end of the year. So this has not been published yet, but it's something that we're working on. And again, lots of colleagues that have been working with me at these sites, and if you want to learn more, there's that book that I have coming out in April, First Steps, How Upright Walking Made Us Human. So thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. And we'll definitely look forward to hearing more about bipedalism on later this spring. We're going to have an event with Jerry and his book. So stay tuned for that. But for those of you watching us live, now is the time to get those questions into the chat. So if you haven't gotten them in, get them in. I have an initial question. I'd like to kind of go back to talking about Darwin. What really is the significance of Charles Darwin's contributions to understanding human evolution?
Yeah. So, I think about it in a couple of different ways. The first is that think about how many scientists today work on this question in various ways, whether it's fossils or the genetics of humans or human biological diversity. Just think about the thousands of scientists who, in some way, shape, or form, are asking the similar kinds of questions or questions that ultimately trace their roots back to the kinds of questions that Darwin asked. And so he has this remarkable legacy of getting the ball rolling on this inquiry into who we are, why we are the way we are, and where we came from as a species. The other big thing that I think is important is that Darwin was able to position humans within this extraordinary tree of life, right? That if you look at all the living organisms out there, they're our cousins. We're related to everything. We're related to a chimpanzee, sure, but also you're related to your dog. You're related to the squirrel climbing the tree. You're related to the tree. You're related to bacteria. Ultimately, everything is related, and so there's this really beautiful connection between all living things, and we understand through Darwin and beyond some of the mechanisms by which diversity of life has evolved. But he was, his ability to move us from linear thinking, ladder-like thinking, to tree-like thinking, and that everything at the tips of those branches living today, butterflies and birds and goats and humans and chimps and everything, is that we're all related, is such an extraordinary message that I think resonates today, or it should, with folks. And the last thing I'll mention, sorry to go on with this, I'm on a Darwin kick these days. Look, he said that human evolution was knowable, and prior to him, there were a lot of folks saying, we'll never, we can't ever know. And he's saying, no, we can know that human evolution with the right tools and the right questions is knowable. And what arrogance to say that before we had a good fossil record, before he even knew about DNA. And yet he's right. This is something knowable. And what an amazing achievement that humans have asked the right kinds of questions to know about their own origins and their own evolutionary history, their own ancestry. It's amazing. Now, there's a lot we still don't know, but the fact that it's knowable was a huge contribution, I think, from Darwin.
And I feel like some of the questions need to, stay unanswered for at least a little bit while longer, so we can still ask questions
and still give Leakey grants, right?
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
That's right.
So, one last question on Darwin: where does Darwin weigh on the bipedalism?
Yeah, so he again didn't have much data to work with, and he hypothesized that bipedal walking, canine reduction, tool use, brain enlargement, that these were things that were happening as a suite of characters, and they would have all sort of happened coincident with bipedalism freeing the hands for tool use allowing for a greater access to resources in the environment. There's your raw material for the brain enlargement, and you've got tools, so you don't need those sharp canines anymore. So all these things happening as a suite. So, okay, was he right? How do we know? Well, you need fossils for that. And we now have a rich enough fossil record early in the lineage's history to know that that's not how it happened, that brain enlargement happens much later. Stone tool construction and use appears to happen much later, but that bipedalism and canine reduction might be a little closer, but still it looks like bipedalism preceded that too. Some of these early hominins, like the skull that Johannes talked about last week, got pretty big canines. Yeah. And so bipedalism seems to be the first thing that happens early in our lineage. And I think it sets the stage for those other things, but they don't happen as coincident as Darwin. And I think he would have loved that. Again, I imagine, I tell my students all the time, can you imagine showing Lucy to Charles Darwin? Right? He would have lost his mind. He would have loved that idea of a small-brained hominin that's walking on two legs. What an awesome discovery. And of course, he would have then changed his mind about how bipedalism got started. He also talked a lot about freeing the hands for weaponry, and he sort of set the stage for this idea of bipedalism actually being rooted in violence, which I think is deeply flawed. And I don't think that's how bipedalism originated. I think we were vulnerable. I don't think we were violent. I think instead the evidence points to us actually being more caring and compassionate and helping each other out, rather than being violent with one another.
Well, thank you so much. And if you want to hear more about Darwin and what he got right and what he got wrong about human evolution, you'll have to join us on Saturday. Now let's take some questions from our viewers. Let's see. Our first question is coming up now. This is from Ashley Hammond, who's the curator of anthropology at the American Museum of Natural History. She says, "Hi, Jerry. Great talk. Do you have a favored scenario for the origins of bipedality? Why do you think bipedalism evolved?"
Thanks, Ashley. It's so good to get the question. I hope you are well. So a lot of hypotheses about the origins of bipedalism. The starting point is a chimpanzee, and evolving a chimpanzee into a human, I think is a flawed exercise. I think the more we discover in the fossil record, the more it points to the last common ancestor being more generalized, and probably being more bipedal than a modern chimpanzee is. And so I think the hypotheses that start with something knuckle walking may be flawed. Now, the discovery. So if Professor Hammond goes to Kenya and discovers a 10 million year old knuckle walking ape, then that's back on the table, right? So new fossil discoveries can always and should always force us to go back and reconsider our ideas. But given the evidence we currently have, I think bipedalism was something that was probably began in a more arboreal environment, moving upright in the trees. And then as there were ecological changes, that you already had a body that was more predisposed to being upright. And so instead of it being a new locomotion, it would be an old locomotion just in a new setting. And so then I think we have to ask the question of how do we not just go extinct? So at that point, how did bipedalism become advantageous and tilt the scales closer, in the direction of survival rather than extinction? So I think it's a slightly different kind of question that we need to be asking of these early hominins, of which we don't have enough fossils to really know. And so, that 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 million year time period when this was going on, right? We don't have much. And so that becomes a critical time period for us to really understand the paleo environment and frankly just the anatomy of hominins and hominids that were living at that time. One last thing on this is that I also think it's probably a flawed exercise to just pick one explanation for the origin of bipedalism. Most likely there were multiple possible advantages to moving in this particular way. Those might have shifted through time. Those might have been different in different ecosystems throughout Eastern and Southern Africa, depending on where sort of the earliest hominins were. And so we always want to do this. We always want to pick, find the reason. And most likely it was, a confluence of advantages that led to the hominin lineage actually making it, and not just going extinct.
We have quite a few questions, so let's move on to the next one. I've heard that bipedalism helps babies' brains develop outside the womb, exposed to social and environmental factors early on. But what's to say that other
altricial,
altricial, thank you, animals don't also have that opportunity?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point. Bears, for instance, are born. They're the size of your thumb when they're born. So right now in the Vermont woods, our bears are hibernating and giving birth to these tiny little altricial things that then right outside the womb would have plenty of opportunity to learn the things they need to learn to be a good bear. Okay, so Holly Dunsworth has done some really wonderful work on this. She published a paper a couple of years ago showing that in fact humans are not born earlier than expected. That given our mass as primates, our gestation length is not only what you would expect it to be, it's longer than what you would expect. And so this idea that we're born earlier because of the shape of our pelvis, and that if a baby grew internally any more than it does, that birth wouldn't be tenable, seems to be problematic. And yet, what we can tell in the fossil record and in comparing the bones of hominins to the other apes that were related to chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans and gibbons, is that bipedalism did lead to some major changes in the shape of the pelvis, and it reduced certain dimensions of the birth canal. And I think the most important thing it led to was rotational birth. And that a baby would end up being facing in the other direction, which maybe wouldn't necessitate, but there would be advantages to having helpers present. And so Karen Rosenberg and Wendy Trevathan have written a lot about this, that midwifery might be deeply rooted in the past. And I think that's probably true. So I've got, so here's Lucy's pelvis right here. And if we, so here's a chimpanzee, okay, so a baby chimpanzee. So if you try to birth a baby chimpanzee through Lucy's pelvis, it gets stuck. And the only way to then birth it is to actually rotate it through. And that is even more problematic when you incorporate the shoulders, the wide shoulders that the infants would have had. So by evolving a bipedal pelvis, again, I think, and we're going to need more evidence to examine this, I think that then introduces this rotational birth that is relatively unique to humans. And so really interesting combination of anatomical changes related to bipedalism that then impact the behavior of humans, and having caretakers and perhaps even midwives present during delivery, and that being deeply rooted in human ancestry back to Australopithecus.
Well, thank you for having such a great collection to just quickly reference. I feel like we should just have a tour from the rest. But let's take another question from the audience. How has COVID-19 affected your research, and what projects have you been able to work on during the pandemic?
Oh, thank you for the question. So it's been hard. It's been hard on so many folks, and we've been very fortunate in Vermont to have fewer cases than I think the rest of certainly the rest of the country has seen. And so my kids have remained in in-person school, and that has been absolutely critical for me to continue to do my work. But of course, without being able to travel, it's been hard. And there are I think there are two ways I can answer the question. The first is I'm grateful to colleagues overseas who continue to find fossils and to 3D laser scan them and send me digital copies, so I can start doing work on these fossils. So I have partners in Germany. So Madeline Burma, who's worked at a Miocene site in Germany, has been sending me casts and 3D scans of fossils. And then Lee Berger's work in South Africa, a new site called the 105 site, has been sending me updates. And so I'm able to continue to work even though I can't go there. And so I'm grateful for digital access to scans. And so I think this is going to promote the more sharing of data and more sharing of information. Would be my hope. One of the other things that's happening is local projects. Now, if you're a paleontologist, if you're interested in fossils, New England's one of the worst places to be. However, there are some fossils, and there's a mammoth site that was discovered in 1848 when a railroad was cut through the state. And a colleague of mine and I have carbon dated a rib from that mammoth. And it turns out that it's a very late occurring mammoth that coexisted with the first humans to reach New England. And so now we're really interested in whether there was any interaction between humans and this elephant. And so we've identified the site where it was found, and we're hoping to maybe do some test pits and some excavation. And then the last thing I'll mention is a Dartmouth undergraduate, Kyle Rosen, has done this really wonderful project where he has sent surveys to zoos all over the United States, asking about bipedal behavior in their zoo animals, because it seems to me that whenever there's a there's a zoo ape that's moving bipedally, it's a gorilla. It always seems to be a gorilla. This gorilla at Zoo Atlanta. There's a gorilla at the Philadelphia Zoo named Lewis, who didn't like to squish the tomatoes he would gather in his enclosure, and he kind of learned the hard way that if you knuckle walk with tomatoes in your hands and you're a 500-pound gorilla, they squish, and he gets really upset. So what he'll do is gather them up and move bipedally. And so, are gorillas most predisposed to bipedalism, or is it something, is it an orangutan? I've seen orangutans walking on two legs in zoos. There's one at the Smithsonian, Bonnie, who does that a lot. And so we sent out this survey, and we got wonderful results, such rich results from 500 different primates. And we can start to sort of tease apart the body form that makes bipedalism the easiest, and it's just not a hard locomotion for some of these animals to engage in. And then we can look at the circumstances behind the bipedal locomotion in these animals and sort of control for environment. Everyone's in the zoo. Now zoos differ, right? But not as much as the forests of Asia and the forests of Africa differ. And so it's almost like you're putting some control on the ecology. So that's been a fun project as well, that we're still wading through the results before we submit it for publication.
Oh, let's get on to another question, because we've been quite. Okay, let's see here. If you feel so inclined, can you say a few words about what you find interesting about the Hobbit Foot?
Hey, Paige, it's great to get your question. Paige is an amazing paleoanthropological historian, and okay, so the Hobbit Foot. I've got the Hobbit head. I should have the Hobbit Foot with me as well. So Homo floresiensis, for those who don't know, was discovered roughly 15, almost 20 years ago now, and it was incredibly puzzling to have such a small-brained, late-occurring hominin on the island of Flores in Indonesia. I've not seen the original material. I've only looked at printouts from 3D scans of the fossils that were provided by Matt Teixeira. But that foot's weird. That foot is so wonderfully weird. In many ways, it does look like the foot of genus Homo. The ankle joint looks a lot like ours in certain ways. Unfortunately, there's no heel. But the proportions, it's got such long metatarsals and then crazy long phalanges as well. And so to have such a long foot would signal to me, again, a slight kinematic difference in how Homo floresiensis would have walked versus how most humans walk today. That it probably would have had to have a little more leg lift to it, and walk almost like a Vermonter with snowshoes on. Now that may not be correct. We'll have to continue to do that. Folks will have to continue to do that analysis to figure that out. But that is a really interesting foot. And again, it shows you that 15, 20 years ago, we thought we had this figured out, of a nice linear foot evolution. And then all these new discoveries just have shattered that simplistic view of not only foot evolution, but human evolution in general, that it was so much more complicated and frankly, so much more interesting than I think we once knew or thought.
Well, we're running out of time. I think we covered so much today. I felt like it was quite a feat to try to fit this much into 60 minutes. But I do have one last question. What advice do you have for those who are watching this episode today who are interested in studying paleoanthropology?
Oh, that's a great question. So read all you can, and don't assume we already have this figured out. There, I think a lot of students of this think that we already have most of human evolution figured out, and you can just kind of nibble at the edges to answer the remaining questions. And I don't think that's the case at all. I think now look, I think we'll always, even 1,000 years from now, 10,000 years ago from now, humans and chimpanzees will still be sister taxa. I don't think that's going to change. It's not like we're suddenly going to be related to squirrels. But there's so much about human evolution that we still don't fully understand. So don't assume we have this figured out. There are so many more discoveries still to be made. Where's the Lucy version of a chimpanzee? What did chimpanzees look like 3 million years ago? We have no idea. And it would be magnificent to have that information. It would allow us to restructure a lot of how we ask other questions about human evolution. So that would be the first advice. The second advice is, you often hear that paleoanthropology is cutthroat, and that it's this vicious science, and everyone's nasty to each other, and are there individuals that you might want to avoid? Yeah, absolutely. But for the most part, I have been met by nothing but collegial individuals who are just trying to figure out where humans came from. Like, we're so lucky to be doing this, and most of the people, including individuals that I in an academic way disagree with, we still are friends, and we still appreciate what the other does. And so, it really isn't as nasty as I think people say it is. I think it has that unfortunate reputation, and it's undeserving in many ways. That's not to say that again, there are individuals to avoid, but learn who those are. And here's the thing: there are enough fossils, and there are enough cool questions to ask that you can avoid those people, and you can just focus in on the questions that interest you, and work with the people that you want to work with, and the others, don't work with them. And you can still do some pretty awesome science.
Well, thank you. So that was really excellent advice. Thank you so much, Jerry. This was a really fascinating and wonderful episode. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Ariel. I really appreciate the opportunity to be on, and the questions were fantastic. It was nice to hear from Ashley and Paige and other folks. Thank you.
Yeah. So if you would like to learn more about the Leakey Foundation, you can visit us at leakeyfoundation.org. You can also learn how to help support research like Jerry's, educational programs like Lunch Break Science. Right now, all donations will be doubled by 2 generous donors, meaning your impact will be doubled. This Saturday, February 13th, we explore Darwin's ideas about human evolution in the light of modern science in our virtual event, A Most Interesting Problem. Be sure to register today to watch the event live. Jerry and a spectacular lineup of scholars give short talks with a live Q&A and participate in a discussion led by award-winning science journalist Ann Gibbons. We shared a link to register in the chat and the video description. Registration also comes with a 30% discount to purchase Jerry's book, A Most Interesting Problem, from Princeton Press. Jerry will also be back in the spring to give a virtual speaker series talk on his new book, First Steps, How Upright Walking Made Us Human. So stay tuned for more details soon. On February 18th, in 1 week, we meet Baldwin scholar and Leakey Foundation scientist Dagmawit Getahun and learn about the evolution of gelada monkeys and their ancestors. Still hungry for science and can't wait till our next live program? Check out the Leakey Foundation's award-winning podcast, Origin Stories, available wherever you listen to podcasts. Be sure to subscribe to the Leakey Foundation's YouTube channel, follow us on Facebook and Twitter, or sign up for our newsletter to be the first to hear about upcoming episodes, all the programs we shared today, as well as groundbreaking discoveries in human evolution research. Lunch Break Science is made possible by the generous support of the Ann and Gordon Getty Foundation and Camilla and George Smith. Thank you all for taking a break from your day and feeding your brain with the Leakey Foundation. Until next time, stay hungry for knowledge.